The morning Amelia spilled hot coffee on a man worth more than most small countries, she had already decided it was going to be a bad day. Not in the dramatic sense. Nothing had collapsed. No one had called with terrible news. It was more of a feeling that settled somewhere behind her sternum around 6 a.m, when her alarm didn't go off, and she woke up 20 minutes late with her heart already pounding before she even opened her eyes. That particular kind of bad. The quiet, grinding kind that doesn't announce itself, just accumulates. She worked at the Langford, a private events venue on the Upper East Side of Manhattan that specialized in the kind of gatherings most people never heard about. Corporate dinners for executives who didn't want press. Celebrations for families whose names appeared in financial news but never in social columns. Amelia had been a floor coordinator there for 3 years, and she was good at her job precisely because she understood one fundamental rule. Be useful, be invisible, be gone before anyone remembers you were there. It was a Thursday in late October. The venue had been booked for a private luncheon, 12 guests, a reserved dining room on the second floor, nothing unusual on paper. The client had reserved under a holding company name, which wasn't strange. Half their bookings came in that way. Amelia had reviewed the setup that morning, confirmed the floral arrangements, tested the sound system for the background music, briefed the 2 servers assigned to the room. Everything was in order by 11:15. She was carrying a tray with the pre-poured welcome beverages, a request from the client, 4 coffees and 2 teas, when the elevator opened directly in front of her. She wasn't expecting anyone to be on that elevator. The guests weren't scheduled to arrive for another 30 minutes. She had her head slightly down, watching the tray, and when the doors slid apart, she stepped forward purely by habit, the way she always crossed that particular stretch of hallway without looking up, because there was never anyone there at 11:17 on a setup morning. The collision was quiet, as disasters sometimes are. The tray tilted. 2 of the coffees went forward. She heard the sound before she fully processed what had happened. That specific, awful sound of liquid hitting fabric. And then she looked up. He wasn't looking at the coffee. He was looking at her. That was the first thing she registered, and it was the thing that stayed with her longer than it should have. Not the ruined suit. Not the 2 men flanking him who moved almost simultaneously. One reaching toward her as if she were a threat, the other scanning the hallway in both directions. Not the absolute stillness that seemed to radiate outward from him like heat from a surface that had been in the sun too long. He was looking at her, and his expression was completely unreadable. "I'm so sorry," Amelia said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. I wasn't expecting. I'm so sorry, sir. Please let me." She was already reaching for the small towel tucked into her apron. The man to her left caught her wrist. Not hard, not aggressive, just stopped her, the way you stop a door from closing. Firm, certain, final. "Don't," he said quietly, and he wasn't talking to her. The grip released. Amelia stood very still. Her heart was doing something unpleasant. The man in front of her was young. Younger than she'd expected, given everything else about him. Late 20s, maybe 30 at the outside, with dark hair swept back and a face that was almost unsettlingly composed. The white shirt beneath his open jacket had 2 dark stains spreading across the front. The tattoos that climbed his neck were visible above his collar, intricate and dark, the kind of work that took years, and said something deliberate about the person wearing it. He still hadn't looked away from her. "Which room?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "The Meridian room, sir. 2nd floor, East Wing." She paused. "I can have someone bring a fresh. We have a dry cleaning service if you need. Send someone to the car for a shirt." He said this to the man on his right, who nodded once and turned without a word. Then he walked past her. No apology, no anger, no acknowledgement that anything had happened at all. His footsteps were even, unhurried, as if coffee didn't exist, as if she didn't exist, as if the small crisis had already been filed away somewhere and closed. Amelia stood in the hallway holding a tray with 2 empty glasses and her heart somewhere in her throat. The man on his left paused as he passed her. He was older, with a closely trimmed beard and the kind of posture that came from years of paying attention to everything. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, not unkindly, but with an assessment in it that made her feel briefly like a problem being calculated. "The Meridian Room setup," he said. "You're coordinating?" "Yes." "Stay on the floor." He moved on. She didn't know what that meant. Stay on the floor instead of what? Instead of going back downstairs? Instead of leaving? She stood there for another 3 seconds, tray in hand, trying to locate her professional composure, which seemed to have scattered somewhere between the elevator and the collision. She found it eventually. She always did. The luncheon proceeded without visible incident. Amelia stayed at the service station outside the Meridian Room as instructed, monitoring the servers through the small rectangular window in the door. The guests arrived in staggered pairs, quiet men in good suits, one woman who carried herself like she was used to rooms standing up when she entered. No one raised their voices. The conversation, what little she could catch, was conducted in the low tones of people who had nothing to prove to anyone in that room. He sat at the head of the table. She noticed, through that narrow window, how the room organized itself around him, without any visible effort on his part. People leaned slightly in his direction when they spoke. They waited. When he said something, and he didn't say much, the table went quieter, not louder. He had changed his shirt. The new one was the same white, perfectly fitted, as if someone had anticipated exactly this contingency. He didn't look toward the door. She told herself she wasn't watching him. She was monitoring the service, which was her job. She checked the water levels, noted when a bread basket needed replacing, watched the timing between courses. At 1:45, one of the servers came out with a slightly stricken expression that Amelia recognized. "He asked for you," the server. "Marcus, 22, 3 months on the job," said under his breath. "Who did?" Marcus glanced at the door. "The one at the head of the table." Amelia smoothed the front of her apron. She checked that the small notepad was in her pocket, an old habit. Then she opened the door. The room didn't go quiet when she entered. It was already quiet. But there was a subtle shift. A few glances. The woman with the commanding posture tracking her from across the table with an unreadable expression. He was looking at her again. "There was an issue with the coffee this morning," he said. His voice was even, low, calibrated to carry just far enough. "I want to make sure it didn't cause a problem for you." The question was so unexpected that for a half-second she almost answered it honestly. "No, sir," she said instead. "No problem at all." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Not aggressive, not warm, something in between that she didn't have a name for. "Good," he said. And then, as simply as that, he looked back at the man he'd been speaking to before she entered. She was dismissed without being dismissed. She walked back to the door with careful, even steps, aware of every inch of floor between her and the exit. Back at the service station, she let out a breath so slow and deliberate it almost didn't count as exhaling. Marcus looked at her. What did he want? She thought about it for a moment. "I genuinely have no idea," she said. And that was the truth. But it was also, she realized, the beginning of something she didn't yet have words for. The first thread of attention that would, over the weeks that followed, pull tighter and tighter until she couldn't remember what it had felt like before it existed. She just didn't know that yet. He came back the following Thursday. Amelia found out the way she found out about most things at the Langford, through the booking system, at 7:15 in the morning, when she was still on her first coffee, and the venue was empty, except for the cleaning crew finishing up on the ground floor. The reservation appeared under the same holding company name, Meridian Room, 12:30. 8 guests this time. She told herself the small, uncomfortable alertness she felt was professionalism, preparation. She was a coordinator. It was her job to notice details, to anticipate, to be ready. She reviewed the setup twice. He arrived at 12:20, 10 minutes early, with 3 men instead of 2. The older one with the beard was there again. She'd learned from Marcus, who had a talent for gathering information without appearing to, that the man's name was Mr. Cho, and that he seemed to function as something between an assistant and a shadow. The other 2 she didn't recognize. They swept the hallway in a way that was almost subtle, almost casual, and would have fooled her completely if she hadn't been paying attention. She was paying attention. This time there was no collision. She was standing at the service station when the elevator opened, clipboard in hand, and she looked up at exactly the right moment, or the wrong one, depending on how she chose to frame it later. He saw her immediately. There was a half-second where she could have looked down, redirected her attention to the clipboard, performed the kind of professional invisibility she had spent 3 years perfecting. She didn't. She met his gaze and gave a small, practiced nod, the kind she gave to all clients. Measured, courteous, impersonal. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. Not quite. More like a door opening a fraction of an inch. Barely perceptible. Gone before she could be sure she'd seen it. Ms. He paused. Amelia, she said. I'm coordinating today's event. Amelia. He said her name the way someone picks up an unfamiliar object, carefully testing its weight. Then he walked past her toward the room. She didn't move for 3 full seconds after he passed. The luncheon went smoothly. More smoothly than the previous week even, which she attributed to the fact that she'd briefed Marcus more thoroughly and confirmed the kitchen timing twice. But she was aware, with a consistency that bothered her, of the closed door at the end of the hall, of the muffled low conversation she could occasionally hear through it, of the way the room seemed to generate its own gravity. At 2:10, Mr. Cho came to the service station. Mr. Kwan would like the room for an additional 45 minutes, he said. Is that possible? Amelia checked her schedule. The room was free until 5. Of course. Mr. Cho nodded. He didn't move immediately. He looked at her with that same careful, calculating attention he'd given her the week before. You're good at your job, he said, in a tone that made it sound less like a compliment and more like a fact he was logging. Thank you, she said. He noticed. A pause. That's not common. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, and Mr. Cho seemed to consider that an acceptable answer. He returned to the room. She stood at the service station and tried very hard not to think about what that meant. The 3rd Thursday followed the same pattern. Then the 4th. By the 5th week, Amelia had stopped pretending to herself that the reservations were coincidental or routine. The Langford had dozens of coordinators. There had been a deliberate request. She didn't know how she knew this, but she knew that she specifically handled these bookings. She knew his name now. Seungmin Kwon. She hadn't looked him up, had resisted it with a stubbornness she recognized as self-protective, but she'd heard it enough times in passing fragments of conversation to have assembled the outline. The holding company was real and legitimate, and very large. What sat beneath it was something else. Something that people at the Langford referred to in the careful, sideways language of people who understood that some things were better left unnamed. She understood the language. She didn't push at the edges of it. What she did do, on the 5th Thursday, was notice that he watched her. Not constantly, not obviously. But when she came into the room to oversee a course change, to address a minor issue with one of the servers, she could feel it. A kind of attention that was different from the way other clients looked at staff. Most people looked through service workers the way they looked through windows. Seungmin Kwon looked at her the way someone looks at something they're trying to understand. It made her feel, alternately, like she was being honored and like she was being catalogued. On the 5th Thursday, when the guests had gone and the servers were clearing the table, he was still in the room. She came in to do her end-of-event walkthrough, another habit, checking for forgotten items, damage, anything that needed to be flagged, and found him standing at the window that overlooked the small courtyard below. He was alone, which was unusual. She almost backed out. I can come back. You don't have to. He didn't turn around. I wanted to ask you something. She stayed near the door. Of course. Do you eat dinner? The question was so plainly stated, so stripped of any performance, that she almost laughed, not from amusement, from the sheer unexpectedness of it. Yes. Generally. Now he turned. His expression was the same contained, unreadable thing it always was, except that there was something underneath it. Something deliberate. Tomorrow evening. There's a restaurant on 64th Street, Sora. 8 o'clock. It wasn't precisely an invitation. It wasn't precisely a command. It existed in some careful space between the two. Amelia thought about every sensible thing she knew. About professional boundaries. About the particular kind of dangerous that came with a certain kind of man. About the fact that she had a good, stable, carefully constructed life that she had built slowly and on her own terms, and that nothing about Seungmin Kwon suggested he respected carefully constructed things. I don't think that would be appropriate, she said. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. He held her gaze throughout it. Why not? He said. Not a question, an invitation to elaborate. You're a client. She kept her voice even. It's a conflict of interest. I'm not a client after today. He paused. I won't be booking this venue again. She stared at him. Why? Because I have what I needed from it. The way he said it, quietly, without any apparent awareness of how it sounded, sent a current through her that she couldn't immediately classify as either alarm or something warmer. Possibly both. Probably both. Mr. Kwon, Seungmin. That's not really. 8 o'clock, he said. You can decide by then. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and walked past her to the door. The two men who materialized from the hallway, she hadn't even heard them there, fell into position beside him without a word. At the door, he paused. He didn't look back, but he paused. I'll have someone confirm the reservation in your name, he said, in case you decide to come. Then he was gone. Amelia stood in the empty Meridian room for a long time. The courtyard outside the window was gray and quiet, a few last October leaves collecting against the stone border. The table still held the ghost of the afternoon, linen slightly displaced, water glasses half empty, the particular stillness of a room that had recently held people, and now held only their absence. She didn't know what she was going to do. That was a lie, actually. Some part of her, the part that had been paying careful, reluctant attention for 5 Thursdays in a row, already knew. She was going to go. She was going to walk into that restaurant on 64th Street at 8 o'clock, and she was going to sit across from a man whose world operated by entirely different rules than hers. And she was going to do it with her eyes open and her hands steady and that particular composure she had spent years learning to maintain. What she couldn't predict, what frightened her more than anything else about the situation, was what happened after that. Sora was the kind of restaurant that didn't need to advertise. There was no sign above the door, just a small brushed metal plate with the name in lowercase letters. The kind of understated detail that communicated everything to the people it was meant for and nothing to anyone else. A man in a dark coat opened the door before Amelia reached it, which meant someone had been watching the street. She filed that away without reacting to it. Inside, the lighting was low and amber, the tables spaced far enough apart that conversation stayed private without any effort. The room smelled of cedar and something floral she couldn't identify. Soft music moved through the space like water, present but directionless, impossible to locate its source. Every surface was dark wood, or stone, or matte black. The effect was beautiful in a way that felt slightly like pressure. The hostess smiled at her with the particular warmth of someone who had been told to expect her. Ms. Amelia, right this way. She was led to a table near the back, half recessed into an alcove that offered a clear view of the entrance without being visible from most of the room. She noticed this immediately. The position was not chosen for ambiance. It was chosen for sightlines. Seungmin was already there. He stood when she approached, which surprised her. It was such a simple gesture, almost old-fashioned, and it didn't fit neatly into the image she had been quietly assembling of him. He was wearing a dark jacket over a black shirt, no tie, and the tattoos at his neck were visible above the collar, that intricate, climbing ink that she had been careful not to stare at during the Thursdays at the Langford, and found herself noticing again now. "You came," he said. "I said I'd decide by 8, she said. "I decided." The ghost of something crossed his face. She was starting to learn how to read the small variations in his stillness, how a slight shift near his eyes meant something different than a shift near his mouth. It wasn't a smile. What happened then? But it was adjacent to one. They sat. The dinner was not what she expected, and she couldn't have said what she had expected exactly, only that this wasn't it. He asked her questions, real ones, not the performative interest of someone filling silence. How long she had lived in New York, whether she had chosen event coordination or arrived at it sideways, the way most people arrived at what they did, what she thought about the city in October versus the city in summer, which was a stranger question than it sounded, and one she found herself answering at length without meaning to. He listened the way very few people listened, completely, without preparing his response while she was still speaking. She was careful. She kept herself measured. But somewhere around the second hour, somewhere between the entrees and a silence that settled comfortably rather than awkwardly, she became aware of a loosening, something in her posture, in the distance she'd been maintaining, and she pulled it back deliberately. "You ask a lot of questions," she said. "You answer them," he said. "I'm trying to figure out why." He turned his glass slightly on the table. "Because you're honest. Most people tell me what they think I want to hear. Most people probably have good reasons for that," she said carefully. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "They do." It was the first time he had acknowledged, without naming it, the particular shape of his world. The acknowledgement was so minimal, so precise, that she almost missed it. But she didn't. She didn't ask. She didn't push. And she suspected that this, the fact that she didn't, was something he was also noticing. He walked her out at 10:30. The city was cold and bright, the kind of October night that makes Manhattan look like it was designed to be cinematic. There was a car at the curb, long and dark, and she assumed it was his. "I'd like to see you again," he said. "Not can I, not would you want to." A statement of intention, offered plainly. "I need to think about it," she said. "All right." She had expected resistance, or persuasion, or at minimum some further pressure. There was none. He simply accepted it, and that uncomplicated acceptance was somehow more unsettling than argument would have been. She thought about it for 4 days. She said yes. It happened gradually after that, the way water finds its level, without drama, with a kind of quiet inevitability. They had dinner twice more in November. A Saturday afternoon once, when he showed up at a coffee shop 3 blocks from her apartment, and she strongly suspected it wasn't coincidental. And they sat for 2 hours while rain moved across the windows. He was different in daylight, or perhaps she was, less guarded, in small increments that she measured carefully. She learned things. Not about his work. He never spoke about it directly. And she never asked directly. And this mutual agreement existed between them without ever being stated. But she learned the shape of him in other ways. That he slept very little. That he had opinions about architecture that he expressed in the same measured tone he seemed to use for everything. That he had a younger sister. That he carried this fact with a particular weight. That he didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. She learned that he watched the room whenever they were in one. Not nervously. Not with any visible tension. Just always, perpetually aware of every entrance and exit and person within proximity. The way someone who has spent years in a certain kind of vigilance cannot fully turn it off. She wondered sometimes what it cost him, carrying that kind of attention every hour of every day. She didn't ask that either. What she hadn't anticipated, what crept up on her with an honesty she found difficult to manage, was that she started to feel safe around him, which made no rational sense. He was objectively, structurally, the least safe person she had ever spent time near. But there was something in his consistency, in the way he was exactly the same every time she saw him. No performance, no shifting, that her nervous system had apparently decided to interpret as reliable. She recognized this as dangerous. She recognized it and kept going anyway. The first time she saw his world intersect with hers without buffer or warning was a Wednesday evening in late November. She was leaving work, descending the steps of the Langford at 6:45, and there was a man on the sidewalk she didn't recognize who was looking at her with a directness that didn't feel coincidental. She walked past him. He fell into step beside her. "You're the one spending time with Quan," he said conversationally. She stopped walking. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do." He was smiling, but nothing about it was friendly. "Tell him Danny Park says hello. Tell him what he owes is coming due." And the timelines moved up. "He'll know what that means." She didn't respond. She started walking again, faster, and he didn't follow her past the corner. She told Shungmin that night. She called him. They had exchanged numbers somewhere in October. The exchange so practical and unannounced she couldn't quite remember when. And she told him exactly what had happened, word for word, standing in her apartment kitchen with her coat still on. There was a silence on his end that lasted about 5 seconds. "Are you home?" he said. "Yes. Stay there. Sungmin. Amelia." Her name in his voice. That particular way he used it that she still hadn't gotten used to. Deliberate. Like it meant something specific to him. "Please stay there." She stayed. 2 of his men were outside her building within the hour. She knew because she looked out the window and recognized the particular posture of professional stillness on the 2 figures near the front entrance. She should have been more alarmed by that than she was. She stood at the window in the dark and watched them and felt, underneath the anxiety, that same irrational steadiness she didn't know how to reason herself out of. He came himself at 9. She let him up. He came through her door and stood in her small living room and looked at her with an intensity she felt physically. A pressure in the center of her chest, like proximity to something generating its own weather. "You're all right," he said. It wasn't a question. It was something he was confirming for himself. "I'm fine," she said. "Who is Danny Park?" His jaw tightened. The first crack she had seen in the surface of him, small and quickly controlled. "Someone I'll deal with." "He was outside my job, Sungmin. He knew who I was." "I know." Something moved in his expression. Not guilt, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Responsibility settling. "I know, I'm sorry." The apology surprised her more than almost anything else he had said or done. It was direct and unqualified, and she could see it cost him something to say it. She sat down on the edge of the couch. He stayed standing. After a moment, she said, "Is this going to keep happening? People knowing who I am?" He was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. "Possibly," he said. "I won't lie to you." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The lamp in the corner threw warm light across one side of his face, left the other in shadow. And she thought, not for the first time, not for the last, that this was an accurate portrait of him, half visible, half something she couldn't see. "I need you to be honest with me," she said, "about the risks, if we're going to keep doing this." "We're going to keep doing this," he said. Not a question. Again, not a question. And again, she should have pushed back against the certainty of it, the presumptuousness. And again she found that she couldn't quite locate the will to. "Then be honest with me," she repeated. "I will," he said. "I am." She believed him. That too was probably dangerous, but she believed him. December came in hard and cold, the kind of cold that settles into the city's bones and stays. Amelia had rearranged her life in small ways she tried not to examine too closely. She took different routes to work, varying them the way Mr. Cho had quietly suggested when he appeared at her door one evening with Shungmin. Not as a bodyguard in that moment, but almost as something like an emissary. delivering practical information in the careful tone of someone who understood that she needed facts, not instructions. She noticed exits when she entered rooms. She paid attention to faces that appeared more than once in her peripheral vision. These were not natural habits for a woman who coordinated private luncheons for a living, and the fact that she had acquired them without much resistance told her something about how much had shifted. She and Seungmin had settled into a pattern. Not domesticated, not casual. Those words didn't fit anywhere near him, but consistent. He was reliable in the ways that mattered, and impossible in the ways she was learning to anticipate. He showed up unannounced sometimes, always with his men nearby, always with that quality of having materialized rather than arrived. He called when he said he would. He never made promises he didn't intend to keep, which meant he made very few promises, but the ones he made landed with a weight that she'd stopped discounting. She had also stopped pretending she wasn't in something. She wasn't certain what to call it, but she had stopped pretending. The night everything shifted was a Friday in mid-December. She had been invited, through Seungmin, which meant she hadn't entirely had the option of declining, to an event at a private club in Midtown. Not a party, he'd said, which turned out to mean it was a party in the way that a controlled burn is a campfire. The kind of gathering that looked elegant on the surface and operated according to rules she couldn't see. She wore a black dress and the small gold earrings she saved for occasions she wanted to take seriously, and when Seungmin's car came for her at 9, she sat in the back and looked out the window and gave herself one long, honest moment of acknowledging that she was nervous. The club was on the 4th floor of a building that had no exterior signage. The elevator opened into a room of dark walls and low light, jazz from somewhere live and unhurried, perhaps 60 people arranged in clusters that had the look of geography, certain areas of the room belonging to certain people in ways that weren't marked, but were understood. Seungmin arrived 11 minutes after she did. She was standing near the bar with a glass of water. She'd decided against alcohol without quite deciding it, when she felt the room change. Not dramatically. A slight reorientation, like a collection of compasses responding to a shift in magnetic north. Conversations didn't stop. Heads didn't turn. But something adjusted, and she had been paying enough attention to his effect on spaces to recognize it. He found her without appearing to search. "You look uncomfortable," he said, arriving at her side. "I look fine," she said. "You look fine and uncomfortable." He stood beside her rather than in front of her, both of them facing the room, and she found this somehow easier than being looked at directly. You don't have to talk to anyone you don't want to. That's a remarkably low bar. It's the only bar that matters here. A woman approached them 20 minutes later, late 30s, impeccably dressed, the kind of beauty that came with a consciousness of itself. She greeted Seungmin with familiarity, a kiss near the cheek, and then turned her attention to Amelia, with a smile that was perfectly constructed and contained absolutely no warmth. "I didn't know you were bringing someone," she said to Seungmin. Her English was accented, slightly. Korean, Amelia thought. "Now you know," Seungmin said. The woman's smile adjusted by a fraction. "She's lovely," said to Seungmin, not to Amelia, as if Amelia were a piece of decor being assessed. "Her name is Amelia," Seungmin said. His voice was the same as always, even, controlled, but something underneath it had changed temperature. "And she's standing right there." A brief silence. The woman looked at Amelia again, this time with something more genuine in it. Surprise, maybe, or recalculation. "Of course," she said. "I apologize." And then she drifted away, back into the room, back into whatever geometry she belonged to. Amelia kept her expression neutral. Inside, something had shifted, not dramatically, but definitively, the way he had said it. She's standing right there. No elevation in his voice, no performance. Just a correction, clean and immediate, that had carried the full weight of his authority behind it without requiring any of its volume. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. They stood there for another minute, watching the room, and she was aware of his arm close to hers, close enough that she could feel the warmth of it without contact. "Who was that?" she asked eventually. Someone who confuses proximity to power with the possession of it, he said. She almost laughed. She turned it into a small exhale instead. It was later that night, much later, when the event had thinned and they were in the back of the car moving through the empty 3 a.m. streets, that the evening broke open. His phone had been active all night. Subtle vibrations she'd noticed even when he didn't visibly react to them. At one point, Mr. Cho had appeared at his shoulder for a low, brief exchange that Seungmin had ended with a single word she didn't catch. She had learned to read the texture of these interruptions. Some were routine, some were not. And by the time they got into the car, she understood that something was happening. She didn't ask. She looked out the window. "There's a situation," he said. He was looking at his phone, and his voice had taken on the quality it got when he was managing something internally. Still even, but with a density to it, like a surface under pressure. "Okay," she said. "It may become visible, in your direction." He paused. "Danny Park has been making noise again. More specifically, he's been asking about you." The cold that moved through her had nothing to do with the temperature outside. "What kind of asking?" "The kind that's designed to get back to me." He set the phone down. He looked at her then, directly, with the full attention he usually distributed carefully across the room. "He's trying to locate something I care about, to use it." She held his gaze. "And you care about me." It wasn't a question. The way he said things to her were never quite questions. But she said it plainly, testing the shape of it. He didn't look away. "Yes," he said. Simple. Unqualified. The same weight as everything else he said. She breathed. "What does that mean for me, practically?" "It means you won't be alone." He said it without apology. "I know that's not what you asked for." "I didn't ask for any of this," she said. "No." A pause. "I know." She turned back to the window. The city moved past, lit, and enormous, and indifferent. She thought about her apartment, her job, the careful ordinary life she had built, and she thought about the fact that a man named Danny Park now knew her name, and her face, and was using her as leverage, and she thought about the 2 men who appeared outside her building without being summoned, and how she had looked at them in the dark and felt something she still couldn't properly name. Seungmin. She didn't look away from the window. "Yes." "Tell me how this ends." "With Park." A silence. Outside, a traffic light went from yellow to red, and the car slowed. "He'll be handled," Seungmin said, "before the end of the week." She understood what handled meant, in the language they had developed, in the language of his world. She didn't ask for elaboration. She made a decision, somewhere in that silence, about what she could carry and what she couldn't, about the difference between complicity and proximity, about the fact that she was already past the point where walking away would leave her unchanged. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Okay?" "I trust you," she said. That's what okay means. Something happened in his face then. Something she had never seen there before. Something that moved through the careful stillness of him like a tremor through still water, visible only for a second before the surface settled again. She looked back out the window. The light turned green. He texted her 3 days later. 2 words. "It's done." She sat with her phone in her hands in her kitchen for a long moment. Outside her window, the first real snow of December was falling, light and directionless, settling without drama on the ledge and the street below. She typed back, "Thank you." Then she set the phone down and stood at the window and watched the snow and let herself feel, fully and without managing it, the complicated weight of what her life had become. It wasn't simple. It wasn't safe. It wasn't anything she would have chosen if someone had described it to her a year ago. But she had chosen it. That was the thing she kept returning to. She had chosen it with her eyes open, step by deliberate step, and somewhere in the accumulated weight of those choices was something that felt, underneath all the complication, like the most honest thing she had ever done. She was still standing there when her phone lit up again. "Dinner tomorrow. I'll come at 7. Not a question. She smiled at the window, at the snow, at the particular absurdity of her own life. 7 is fine, she wrote back. January arrived the way January always does in New York. Without ceremony, without the courtesy of a transition. The holidays had passed in a way Amelia hadn't anticipated. She had spent Christmas Eve with her sister in Brooklyn, a small apartment full of good food and familiar noise, and she had felt, sitting at that table, the peculiar sensation of existing in two different lives simultaneously. The one at that table, warm, ordinary, known, and the other one, the one that had been quietly assembling itself since October, that lived in a different register entirely. Seungmin had called on Christmas Day. Brief, unceremonious. Asked if she was well. Told her he was in Chicago for 2 days. She had asked, without planning to, whether he was all right, and the small pause before he answered told her that the question had landed somewhere unexpected for him. "Yes," he'd said. "I'm all right." She believed him. She also heard, underneath it, something that sounded like a man who was not often asked. He came back on the 27th. He took her to dinner at a quiet Italian place in the West Village. Nothing like Sora. Smaller, warmer, the kind of restaurant where the owner knew the regulars by name. She didn't know if he had chosen it deliberately, as a contrast, but she noticed it. She noticed most things about his choices now. The way you start to read a language slowly, and then, one day, realize you've been thinking in it. They were different that evening, not in any way she could have described precisely to someone else. But the careful distances they had both maintained, the measured quality of everything, the way they had both been, from the beginning, so deliberate about what they offered and what they withheld, had contracted, quietly, mutually. The way temperature drops at the end of a day, not as an event but as a gradual, inevitable fact. He told her about his sister. Her name was Jiwoo. She was 24. She was studying architecture in Seattle and had no knowledge, or so he intended to keep it, of what her brother actually was. He spoke about her with a different kind of attention than he brought to everything else. Less contained, the edges slightly looser, and Amelia understood that this was the place where the careful control of him had a natural seam. "You protect her from it," Amelia said. "I try." He turned his glass. "It's the one thing I don't—" He stopped. "Don't what?" He looked at her. "Don't want contaminated by what I am." The word contaminated sat between them for a moment. She thought about responding to it, and then she thought about what he'd actually said. What I am, not what I do, and the difference between those two things was not nothing. "You're not contamination," she said quietly. He looked at her for a long time. "You don't know everything I am." "No," she agreed, "but I know enough to know that's not the right word." Something settled in him then, not resolved. She didn't think resolution was a state he accessed easily or often. But settled, the way a foundation settles, finding its actual depth. It was the second week of January when he said it. They were at her apartment. This had become a thing that happened, him there in her space, which she had initially found destabilizing, and had gradually come to feel like a different kind of normal. He was comfortable in small spaces in a way that surprised her, given how much the world seemed to expand to accommodate him when he moved through it. In her apartment, he sat on her couch without ceremony, drank the coffee she made in the French press she'd bought years ago, occasionally read something on his phone while she worked at the small desk in the corner, and the silence between them was the easy, unperformed kind. They had been talking about something inconsequential, a film she had seen without him, that he had opinions about despite not having seen it, which was characteristic. When his phone went off with a frequency and urgency that shifted the temperature of the room, he stepped into the hallway to take the call. She heard almost nothing, just the low, controlled register of his voice, and a single moment where it went very still, in a way that meant something had happened. When he came back, he sat down, and for a moment said nothing, and she gave him that moment without filling it. One of my men was followed tonight, he said, leaving a location associated with me, photographed. She set down the book she was holding. Someone building a case? Possibly. His jaw was tight. Or someone building leverage. The same kind as before, like Park? Different. He looked at her. The photographs included the location. My man wasn't alone at the location. A pause. You were with him. Outside the restaurant on 6th last week. In the background, but clearly identifiable. The silence that followed was complete. She absorbed it. The implication of it, that someone had been watching not just his movements but hers, that she existed in someone's file now, in someone's calculation as a variable to be used, settled into her with a cold, specific clarity. How exposed am I? She said. Right now the photographs are contained. I'll have them within 24 hours. He said this with the certainty of someone describing a fact rather than a plan. But the person who took them knows what they saw. And that person will be discouraged from acting on it. She looked at him. He looked back. Amelia. Her name in his mouth that way. I need to ask you something directly. Ask. Do you want to leave this? He didn't gesture at himself or at anything. He didn't need to. I need you to tell me honestly, because if you do, I can make it clean. I can make it so that you're not touched by any of it going forward. It would require distance, real distance, but I can ensure your safety, and I can ensure your life returns to what it was. The offer was real. She could hear it. It cost him something to make it, and it was real, and he meant every word of it. She sat with it for a full minute. She thought about the woman she had been in October, the one who had spilled coffee on a man in a hallway and spent the rest of that morning trying to locate her composure. She thought about how small her life had felt then, not in a painful way, but in the way of something that has stayed the same size for too long and doesn't know it. She thought about Brooklyn at Christmas and her sister's kitchen, and the warm, familiar life that had always been the thing she returned to, and she thought about the fact that even there, sitting at that table, she had been aware of the other life, had felt it, had not wanted to give it back. No, she said. He was very still. I don't want to leave it, she said. I want you to stop making decisions about my exposure without telling me first. I want to be part of the conversation about risk, not briefed afterward. I want to know when something is happening that involves me, before it involves me. She held his gaze. Those are my terms. A long silence. Those are reasonable terms, he said. I know they are. Something happened in his face. That movement she had first seen in the car in December, that tremor under still water. This time it lasted longer. This time she could see it more clearly for what it was. Not weakness, not softness exactly. Just the particular expression of a man who has spent years being treated as a force rather than a person, encountering something he doesn't have a practiced response for. I don't know how to do this well, he said. What you're asking for. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to do it perfectly. I'm asking you to try. He looked at her. Why? Because you're worth it, she said simply. Even with all of it. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before it. Fuller. She felt it in the room like a change in pressure, like the moment before a storm resolves, that held breath when the sky has committed to something, and the only thing left is the falling. He reached across the couch and took her hand. Not dramatically. Not with any performance. Just his hand closing over hers, deliberate and warm, with the same certainty he brought to everything. I'll try, he said. They were not a simple thing. They were never going to be. His world didn't simplify, and she stopped expecting it to. And in the stopping, there was a kind of freedom she hadn't anticipated. She kept her job. She kept her apartment, though his men remained a peripheral, unobtrusive presence that she had accepted as the particular shape her safety took in this life. She met Jiwoo in March, when the younger woman came through New York on her way back from a conference, and found in her a warmth and directness that explained something she had wondered about Seung-min, where he had learned, under everything, how to care. Jiwoo had looked at her across the dinner table and said, "He talks about you, you know. He doesn't think I notice, but he does." Seung-min had said nothing. He had looked at his drink. But Amelia had seen the line of his shoulders, the way they sat differently than usual, something in them that was almost, unmistakably, peace. She thought about that night for a long time afterward, about how she had expected, from the beginning, that being near him would feel like standing close to something dangerous and contained, like a fire behind glass, warm but always with that pain between you and the heat. What she hadn't expected was that the glass would turn out to be a door, and that it had been open, she understood now, for longer than either of them had been willing to say.